welcome to today's episode of Hive Happenings. Last week I did hive checks on all the hives, made it a montage, and I made a point to show that we added a box onto the third hive, honey hive. And so this week when I was doing the hive inspections, I saw that all the populations were doing well across the hives. The bees in Hive 3 had even taken to the new box fairly well. They'd drawn a lot of comb very nicely. Eggs were being laid up there, so they seemed to have taken to it well. Hives 1 and 2, though, seem to have a pretty dense population for one box. So I think it's a good time to go ahead and also add a box to them. And I went to go count out my frames, went to go check my boxes, and I realized that while I do have enough frames, some of the frames aren't very high quality. A lot of the frames I have are left over from a previous hive that has failed. And that happens. The bees eventually absconded the hive, and just a very difficult year all around for beekeepers. So it happens. Sometimes the bees will leave if they're unsatisfied with the hive, and they do something called swarming. But that's not super important to today. I wanted to show kind of the process of getting frames prepared. You see that this is kind of coated with wax, but this other side is not. So I wanted to show kind of the process for that. And by doing so, I have a slow cooker here with beeswax inside of it. You might be able to see kind of the liquid. And I have here a bag of beeswax pellets. Let's see if I can get a hand in here. You see, so I'm gonna go ahead and add these to the slow cooker so they can melt down for a little bit more wax, and let it melt the wax. To apply the wax, I'm gonna use a little paint roller, and as it's melted, basically just gonna dip this into the wax and roll it on. And I'm gonna do this with about 4 frames, but in the meantime, I'm also gonna talk about a bit of hive and bee reproduction. So I mentioned that the queens go on a mating flight, typically once in her lifetime, and she flies to an area often referred to as a drone congregation area. I mentioned a couple of times, but drones are male bees, and they effectively serve very little purpose in the hive. Let me adjust this a little bit. There we go. They serve very little purpose in the hive outside of being men. In biology sense, you need a man and a woman to make babies. So the hive goes out on her mating flight shortly after she emerges. She is called a virgin queen in that time until she reaches the drone congregating area, where then she goes and collects genetic material from the many, many drones that would be in that area, the male bees that would be in that area. So she ideally only needs to do this once in her life, and she gets enough genetic material to be able to use the genetic material to lay eggs. So I might have mentioned as well that the way a bee decides a gender, the way the queen decides the gender of a bee, is by fertilizing an egg or not. So she can just lay eggs all she wants. And if she doesn't fertilize the egg, it becomes a drone, whose only purpose is to go to one of these drone congregating areas and then be extra bodies around the hive. If she does fertilize the egg, then it becomes a worker bee, also known as a female bee. And those are the ones you're going to typically see whenever you see bees around, because they're just so much more densely populated. There's such a big part of the population because they do so much more. They do the guarding, they do the foraging, they make the honey, and in very specific situations, they might even lay eggs. They take care of how the queen is prepared, because the queen starts her life pretty much the same as any other worker bee would. The only real difference is that she gets fed something called royal jelly, which also, it's basically the same as drinking your milk. Somebody who really drinks their milk compared to somebody who does not drink any milk. You get your bones big and strong. It's a similar case, except in the queen's case, she goes from being a typical worker bee to the one that has to handle all the egg laying and all the other, well, really all the egg laying. Usually the workers handle most of the work in the hive. And then there's the drones. I've kind of mentioned the drones a few times in that their main purpose, they're bigger than typical bees. I've thrown a few reference pictures here and there in videos. I'll probably throw another one up around here. And they're a bit bigger. They don't have stingers though. That is also a key difference between male and female bees. Female bees have stingers because the stinger is a modified version of an organ called an ovipositor. And the ovipositor is what they use to lay eggs. Male bees don't need to lay eggs, so they end up not having a stinger. And they end up having little fuzzy butts instead of stinger butts. They're pretty cute if you see them up close. But then the worker bees, usually the worker bees have the most rich life. However, in turn for that, the worker bees only live a couple of months many times. Sometimes they only live a few weeks. It kind of depends on the time of year they're born. And you see me bending down over and over. That's me putting a frame down, getting a new frame as I'm painting. But the worker bees, depending on the time of year they're born, they can live anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. But as it starts cooling down, as the fall comes, you'll see them live actually longer. And this is necessary. As it cools down, there's less things to forage, and the bees also don't love the cold. I usually try not to be too present in the beehive if it's below 60 degrees because they're a little bit more susceptible to temperatures below that than we would be. And in that cold time, they actually bundle up in the hive. They bundle up and just stay warm. And that's why it's also important as a beekeeper when it's fall and going into winter, you want to make sure they have a lot of food ready because they would do everything they can to not leave the hive during the winter. But because they're not trying to do a whole lot, the queen is also not trying to lay a whole lot of eggs. So those bees are just kind of made to live a little bit longer, even though they do a lot less in that time. Like I said, they don't leave the hive. In the spring and summer, the bees go through being nurse bees, which help raise the juvenile bees that are hatching out of the comb, to guard bees who stand at the front of the hive and make sure unwanted bees or other hornets maybe don't get into the hive, and to foragers who go out and collect pollen to bring back to the hive to then convert into nectar or pollen, or not convert pollen into pollen, convert into honey, rather. So, yeah, that's kind of the life cycles. That's kind of like each general role of the bees. The worker bees are definitely the most populous, the most robust, the ones that do kind of everything, but the queen is the one ultimately running the show because without a queen, you don't have any workers, you don't get any drones. So there's a little bit of a lecture on bee biology for you all. And soon I'll be finished up with painting these frames and I'll add them to Honey Hive and Hive Black and Yellow, and I'll throw a picture up at the end of all the hives. They'll look like they're 3 boxes tall, but remember, the top box is only there to hold the sugar syrup. In the future, we might change it a little bit. As the summer goes on, the bees might continue to have really robust growth, and we might end up adding a 3rd frame hive box to each one. We just got to see how they go. This is their first year up, and for all intents and purposes, they're growing very, very well. So we'll see. Thanks for checking out.